Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Shadows of Ravenwood. It was a cold evening when I received the invitation. The envelope was unlike anything I had ever seen, black, unmarked, with a wax seal in the shape of a raven silhouette. My heart raced when I opened it and read the letter inside. We are pleased to invite you to the Ravenwood estate, where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than anywhere else. The house has stood empty for decades, but it is waiting for you. Your presence is required. Arrive on the night of the full moon. I didn't know what to make of it. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something in me couldn't. A curiosity, a draw toward the unknown. Ravenwood Estate. The name sent chills down my spine. I had heard of it before. Local legend spoke of a mansion hidden deep in the forest. Abandoned but cursed, its last inhabitants vanishing without a trace years ago. Some said the house was haunted. Others claimed it was a place where dark rituals had once taken place. Against my better judgment, I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and set off in the direction of Ravenwood. The drive was long, with the road twisting and turning through dense trees, the kind that seemed to swallow up any light. As I neared the estate, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The mansion loomed ahead like a shadow from another time, its once grand architecture now decaying and consumed by the forest. I parked my car by the wrought iron gates, which creaked ominously as I pushed them open. The moment I stepped onto the grounds, the air grew cold, and the atmosphere thickened. The house stood in front of me, its windows like dark eyes staring back, watching me. I hesitated for a moment, but the invitation had promised me answers, and I wasn't one to turn back now. The door opened before I could knock, and I stepped inside. The interior of Ravenwood was just as unsettling as its exterior. The walls were lined with ancient portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked past. The floors creaked underfoot, and every room I entered felt colder than the last. The air smelled of mildew and dust. But there was something else, a faint, lingering odor that reminded me of something: death. I was led through a grand hallway by a woman who appeared to be in her late 40s. Dressed in black, her face pale and expressionless. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to send a shiver down my spine. At the end of the hallway, she opened a door and motioned for me to enter. Inside was a large sitting room, where several people stood in the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light. They were all dressed in similar dark clothing, as if attending some kind of somber gathering. One man, older than the others, stepped forward. His eyes were dark and hollow, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Welcome to Ravenwood," he said, his gaze piercing. "I hope you're ready to face what awaits." That night, I learned the truth about Ravenwood. The people gathered there were not guests, but participants. I had been invited not by accident, but as part of a ritual that had been taking place for centuries, one that involved summoning the dead from the other side. The house itself was built on a burial ground, and the spirits of those long deceased lingered in the walls. We sat around a large table in the center of the room, the air thick with incense. A large black book lay before us, its pages yellowed and brittle. The man who had greeted me earlier opened it and began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. His voice seemed to reverberate throughout the room, growing louder with each passing second. The shadows in the room deepened, and a cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the candles that lit our way. The room was plunged into darkness. And then, a figure appeared in the doorway. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered robes. Its face was covered by a hood, but I could feel its gaze on me. The air around it was thick with malice, and a sense of dread washed over me. It wasn't human. It wasn't alive. It was something else entirely, something that belonged in the space between life and death. The other participants recoiled. But the man who had led the ritual remained calm. He smiled and stepped forward, his voice trembling as he addressed the figure. "You have returned," he whispered. "The veil has been pierced." The figure did not respond with words. Instead, it extended a long, skeletal hand toward me. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel a pressure building in my head, as if something was trying to force its way inside. The room began to spin, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was alone in a dark, empty room. The house was silent, but I could hear the faintest whispers echoing in the distance, voices, soft but insistent. I got to my feet, my body aching, and stumbled toward the door. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw the figures of the other participants, standing motionless, their eyes wide open but lifeless. They weren't alive anymore. They had been taken. And now, I was next. I ran through the halls, desperate to escape. But the house seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in around me. Every turn I made led me back to the same place. The front door was nowhere to be found. The whispers grew louder, closer. And then, I saw it, something in the shadows. Something watching me. The last thing I remember was the sound of footsteps behind me. Too close for comfort. The door to the outside world was within reach. But I couldn't move fast enough. I turned around one final time, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure from the ritual was standing right behind me, and its hand was reaching for my throat. I never made it out of Ravenwood. They say the house still stands, hidden deep in the forest, and that every full moon, new visitors are invited to its cursed halls. Some say I'm still there, wandering the halls with the others who didn't make it out. Others say I became one of them, a shadow in the dark, forever trapped between worlds. But if you listen closely, on certain nights, you might hear my voice in the wind, calling out to anyone who dares to approach Ravenwood. And if you do, don't answer. Story 2, The Whispering Shadows. It was an unseasonably cold night when Sarah arrived at the old farmhouse, nestled deep in the heart of the countryside. She had inherited the property from an aunt she barely knew, an eccentric woman who had long been whispered about in the small town. People spoke of her strange habits and the mysterious disappearance of her family many years ago. Sarah, though, had always been more curious than afraid. And when the letter arrived informing her of the inheritance, she couldn't resist the call to see it for herself. The farmhouse, though weathered, stood tall against the night sky, its dark windows staring out like hollow eyes. The creaking of the door as she pushed it open sounded like a warning. But Sarah shrugged it off. She stepped inside, the chill of the house creeping up her spine. She didn't know then that she had crossed into a world where the line between the living and the dead blurred, where secrets long buried beneath the floorboards would soon claw their way out. Sarah settled into the farmhouse that night, determined to explore every inch of the place the next day. But as the clock struck midnight, she heard it, whispers, Low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Was it the wind? The house settling? No. The whispers grew louder, sharper, more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was speaking directly to her, urging her to listen, to uncover the truth hidden within the house. And so, Sarah, against her better judgment, ventured into the basement the following morning, her curiosity now gnawing at her like an insistent hunger. There, hidden beneath the layers of dust and old furniture, she found it, an old journal. The pages were yellowed with age, but the words written inside were clear. The journal detailed the life of Sarah's great-aunt, Eleanor, and the strange occurrences that plagued her family in the years leading up to their disappearance. Eleanor wrote of voices in the walls, shadows that moved of their own accord, and strange figures watching from the windows at night. But the most chilling part was a ritual. Something her family had been a part of long before Sarah's birth, something that bound them to the house and, it seemed, to the spirits that haunted it. As Sarah read the last entries, a sense of dread settled over her. Eleanor had written that she had made a terrible mistake, something that had unleashed the darkness that now lingered in the house. The last words, scrawled hastily: "Read, if you find this. Leave. Before it finds you." It was too late. The air in the house grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. Sarah was no longer alone. That night, Sarah's sleep was restless. Shadows danced in the corners of her room, and the whispers returned, now accompanied by footsteps, soft at first, but growing louder, as though someone, or something, was pacing just outside her door. When she mustered the courage to open it, there was no one there. But then she saw them, figures, standing at the end of the hallway, tall and thin, their faces obscured by darkness. They didn't move, but their eyes seemed to burn into her soul. And then, in a voice that chilled her to the core, one of them whispered her name. Sarah backed away, stumbling into the wall. The figures didn't advance, but they remained, watching her, as though waiting for something. As the days passed, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Objects moved on their own, doors opened and closed without explanation. The whispers grew more urgent, more insistent. Sarah could no longer tell whether she was hearing voices in her mind or from the walls themselves. Determined to end the torment, Sarah dug deeper into the family history, uncovering a chilling truth. Her great-aunt had not just dabbled in the occult, she had made a pact with the spirits. A dark bargain that had tied the family to the house for eternity. But something had gone wrong. The spirits had grown restless, angry. They demanded something more, something Sarah couldn't provide. In a final act of desperation, Sarah attempted to leave. But as she reached the door, the shadows materialized before her, blocking her way. The whispers became screams, loud and deafening. The house seemed to close in around her, its walls pressing in, suffocating her. With nowhere to run, Sarah turned and faced the darkness. "What do you want from me?" she cried out. The answer came not in words, but in a cold, whispering breath at her ear. "Your soul." The house was silent once more, save for the whispers that now lingered in the walls, waiting for the next unwitting soul to cross its threshold. Sarah's fate was sealed. Her name added to the long list of those who had vanished into the shadows of the farmhouse. And somewhere, deep within the house. Her great-aunt's journal was waiting for the next curious soul to find it. But Sarah would never be found. Story 3: The Lingering Silence of Hollow Hill. The town of Ashmere was a place forgotten by time. Tucked away in a misty valley. It seemed perpetually draped in twilight. As though the sun had decided it wasn't worth the effort to shine there. Hollow Hill loomed over the town. A constant shadow on the lives of those who called Ashmere home. Atop that hill sat Blackwood Manor. A crumbling relic of a bygone era that no one dared approach. Catherine "Cat" Arden stepped out of her car and pulled her coat tighter against the damp chill. A journalist by trade, she thrived on uncovering truths hidden in whispers and shadows. Ashmere was the perfect setting for her next story. A tale of haunted houses and missing families. As she walked through the town, she noticed the wary glances of the locals. They avoided her gaze, murmuring among themselves as if her presence had disturbed the delicate balance of their quiet lives. Her inquiries about Blackwood Manor were met with silence or deflections. Only an old man at the local diner, who introduced himself as Henry, offered her any insight. "You're chasing shadows, miss," he said, his voice trembling with age and something more. "That house, it doesn't like visitors. People go up there, but they don't come back the same." Undeterred, Kat made her way up the winding path to the manor. The air grew heavier with each step, the forest around her silent as if holding its breath. When she finally reached the crest of the hill, the manor stood before her, its dark silhouette against the gray sky. It was every bit as foreboding as she had imagined. The front door creaked open with an agonizing groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like drapes in the corners. Kat's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a grand staircase that seemed to climb endlessly into the shadows. She set up her equipment in the parlor. A once grand room now reduced to a shell of its former glory. As the night deepened, the silence grew oppressive. She could hear every creak of the old house, every gust of wind that rattled the broken windows. It started as a faint sound, barely audible, a whisper. Kat froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft, almost intimate, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave," it breathed. She swung her flashlight around, but the beam revealed nothing. Determined not to let fear get the better of her, she muttered to herself, "It's just the wind." But deep down, she knew better. Something was watching her. The next morning, Kat explored the house further. In the study, she found a leather-bound journal that seemed untouched by time. The entries, written in a spidery hand, chronicled the lives of the Blackwood family. They spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, shadows that moved on their own, and a growing sense of dread that had consumed the household. One entry stood out. "We have opened the door, and now it will not close. The hill speaks, and we are bound to listen. The cost of silence is too great." Kat felt a chill run down her spine. She decided to investigate the séance room mentioned in the journal. The room was exactly as described, small, circular, and filled with ritualistic artifacts. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, and the air felt thick with an energy she couldn't explain. As she stood in the room, the whispers returned, louder this time. They spoke in overlapping voices, incoherent but filled with anguish. The floor seemed to shift beneath her feet, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. By nightfall, the house had come alive. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the walls groaned as if they were breathing. Kat's flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness. When the light returned, she saw them, figures made of mist and shadow, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Why are you here?" one of them rasped, its voice echoing in her mind. Kat couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. The figures drew closer, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke in the wind. They whispered of a curse, of a debt that could never be repaid. Summoning every ounce of courage, Kat turned and ran. The house seemed to fight her, the hallways stretching endlessly, the doors slamming shut before she could reach them. Ghostly hands reached out from the walls, clawing at her as she sprinted toward the exit. Finally, she burst through the front door and into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. As she drove away, the whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Kat never published the story. The tapes she recorded were blank, and her notes were scribbled with strange symbols she didn't remember writing. She left her career behind, haunted by what she had experienced. Blackwood Manor remains atop Hollow Hill, its secrets buried in the silence that lingers, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to enter.